The Gilded Age is the time following the Reconstruction era. Gilded is the name given to a piece of metal, cheap piece of metal that's covered with a shiny veneer. The purpose of the Gilded Age is to talk about how the common Americans were struggling in this age, but there's a very shiny veneer covering this very wealthy individuals. Just very quickly, remember out in the West, this is the time of the cowboys, but because of cities and the fact that there are more railroads, and those railroads are now running refrigerated rail cars, they're going to eliminate the need for cattle drives, because instead of trying to drive those cattle and the cowboys pushing the cattle all the way across the country to get to the location that needed for the butchering, they're going to drive to a centralized location like, say, Chicago. All those cattle are going to be slaughtered in Chicago, and then they're going to be put on those refrigerated cars and sent where they're needed to go. So really, the time of the cowboy and the cattle drives are over during this Gilded Age period. This is largely because of industrial growth, but we're going to transition here and talk about the Industrial Revolution. Remember, coming out of the Civil War, the companies had gotten a lot of contracts to make guns and bullets and uniforms and everything else necessary to fight the war, and all of that money helps to grow big business. And as the businesses get bigger, they turn into monopolies. Write down that word monopoly, because you need to understand that that means one business controls all of that means of production for the product. And that means that those monopolies can charge whatever they want. They can treat the workers however they want. And they're going to exploit the working class, which means they're going to take advantage of them, and they're going to kind of take all the money they can away from them. During the Gilded Age, there are some technological innovations that do begin to transition the United States towards a more modern economy. One, the service economy is going to be created because of things like telephones and typewriters and sewing machines. Those are going to allow women to do more work outside of the home. Sometimes we call this the information technology, right? So women are going to work as secretaries, and they're going to become typewriters, working as secretaries and all that. But women now are going to get the opportunity to leave the home. They're not stuck just being in the house, being housewives and mothers. The innovation of electric power is also going to change the way the country looks, because now factories don't need to be next to water sources in order to run. Electricity is going to help power more machinery in more locations. It's going to increase productivity, which means people can do more work with less people. But it's also going to increase working hours, because you work after dark now. So there's goods and there's bads from all this innovation. Big business and the rise of big business is important to recognize that exploitation, because these corporations are going to eliminate competition. Unlike what Mr. Chappell taught you about economics, right? In a capitalist society, the people that start to get an advantage are going to use their wealth and privilege in order to eliminate the opportunities for others. When you see the word corporation, remember we're talking about big business. They have limited liability, which means if the company fails, the owners don't lose all of their money, just whatever was invested in the company. They can sell stock by making their company publicly traded, which means they can gather huge amounts of resources that would otherwise be unavailable to people. They have perpetual life. When a board member dies, they just replace the board member. So, Exxon Oil Company could live forever. They just keep replacing their people. And because of the Supreme Court had a decision that said that corporations are essentially to be treated like people, which means they have the rights and protections of the Constitution. So corporations have free speech, and they have the right to freedom of religion and all the other things. They're to be treated like people. But like I said, the whole point of a monopoly is to eliminate competition. Now, capitalism says that competition should lower prices. So if you eliminate competition, prices go up. And the business owners don't want low prices. They want to make as much money as possible. So some people are going to start calling them robber barons. Now, they don't want to be called robber barons, but a robber baron, a person that's wealthy, a baron that gets their money by robbing people. And you see that in this cartoon here. Pullman was a robber baron, exploiting the working class by giving them low wages but charging high rent. probably the idealized version of one of these robber barons. He would have been preferred to be called a captain of industry, was John Rockefeller. Rockefeller innovated a business model called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration, where all the companies that have a similar business are going to merge together into a single entity, a monopoly. It's also called a trust. Eventually, it's also going to be called a holding company, but that's all the same thing. It's a monopoly. Andrew Carnegie has a slightly different business model. He's going to create steel, but in his business model, he uses a new technology called the Bessemer process, which produces steel faster and cheaper. He's going to take advantage of opportunities because the railroad and all of these new skyscrapers need to have lots and lots of steel. And he's going to vertically align his industry. So when you combine these three things together, Andrew Carnegie is quite the entrepreneur. So what is vertical integration? Well, if this is horizontal integration right here, where all the like companies merge together into one super company, this is vertical integration. You eliminate the middleman, and by eliminating the middleman, you eliminate that middleman's profit. So you're going to pay less for your stuff. So in vertical integration, the company owns all the levels of production. The company owns the cattle, so they don't have to pay a farmer. They own the slaughterhouses, so they don't have to pay the owner of the slaughterhouse. They own the cars, so they don't have to pay a fee to use the cars. And by doing that, it keeps production prices low, which means they can charge less money for the final product. Horizontal versus vertical integration. Now, Carnegie is going to innovate this thing called the gospel of wealth, and it's based on something referred to as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism believes that some people are better fit for a society, so therefore they will rise to the top of society. And in this culture that at the 1889, they believed that God made them rich, right? So Carnegie argues gospel of wealth, that God made him wealthy because he's the best fit for society. He goes to the top. But the gospel of wealth says that he was made wealthy because he knows how to handle money better than poor people. So therefore, his job is to use his wealth to take care of poor people. We call that philanthropy. Okay. So he's going to give a lot of his money to charity. But I think it's weird how all of the best people, the rich people, were all white men during the Jim Crow era. It's almost like they passed laws to try to prevent black people from having the ability to succeed. Anyways, social Darwinism is also going to be used as a business model. Again, if social Darwinism says that the best will rise to the top, right? And that's how rich people are rich. They're just better than everybody else. So poor people are inferior. That's social Darwinism. Corporations are going to use that idea to say that the best businesses will rise to the top. So Standard Oil is the best business, so therefore it becomes a monopoly. You can see here, right? Standard Oil, big business, monopoly. However, once a corporation gets an advantage, the thing that social Darwinism overlooks as a business model is that corporations are going to use their power to influence laws to make it harder for smaller companies to survive. And then they're going to use the market, their ability to lower prices, to crush their competition and eliminate competitors. So monopolies, they're not necessarily the best product. They're the ones that can take advantage of the situation the best. The rich owners still claim that it's capitalism. It's not. It's not competition, and capitalism requires competition. So here's what Carnegie said about the gospel of wealth, just the underlined parts. The duty of the man of wealth, he is called upon to give in the manner which, in his judgment, best calculated to produce the most helpful results for the community. In other words, I'm rich, I know better than you, so poor people should just listen to me so that I can take care of you the best. He is the trustee for his poorer brothers, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to give, and doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. So poor people are inferior, and they should just let the rich people have all their money and take care of them. And in the Gilded Age, the Republicans are in charge. And the Republican Party switches from being focused mainly on free soil, civil rights, and now they're going to become this pro-business party. Owners, workers, and Republicans are all going to support a tariff. The workers are going to want that tariff because it thinks it protects their jobs. Owners want the tariff, remember, a tax on imported goods, because they want to prevent foreign competition. And Republicans are going to support the tariff because it's going to be additional tax revenue. So you can see here, these are wealthy, rich white guys. In political cartoons, people that are wealthy are often drawn as overweight because it shows that they have a lot of substance. And here, what a friend in Coolidge. Coolidge is a Republican president. The theory that the Republican government is using here, and really the government of the United States, even under a Democratic control later, is referred to as laissez-faire capitalism. So in theory, this is the idea, right? So in theory, the government should keep its hands off the economy. That's what laissez-faire means. Hands off. The government shouldn't interfere in the economy, and they should let the businesses run the economy because they know business. And there's almost no regulation of the businesses, sort of, because the government is going to step in and help protect business quite often. But the businesses don't want the government to interfere unless it's to help the businesses. And this is the U.S. government policy during the Gilded Age. And we're going to stop here. Part 2 of the video, the working class. With the rise of big business, there's also going to be a rise of labor unions, and they're going to spring out of the working class. Now, the working class are the people who work full time, and it's going to be a little different than sort of what we think of the modern working class. Conditions are going to be very dangerous, hours are going to be very long, and pay is going to be very low, all as a result of laissez-faire policies where the government is supporting business, even to the detriment of the working class. Women are working. The whole idea that women only worked during World War II, not really a thing. Women did work prior to World War II, but they tended to be poor women and not sort of that middle class white woman that we're going to see when we talk about World War II. They get lower pay, and they're going to be part of this working class because they're easier to physically control as opposed to, say, strong men who can't be intimidated as easily. Children are also going to be part of the labor force. About 1/6 of all kids are employed in some way. Again, they're also going to receive lower pay. They are going to start to see a rise in labor unions. So labor union is when workers organize together to try to protect themselves from the abuses of capitalism. They realize that an individual person can be replaced very easily, but it's harder to replace everybody if they're all going to try to prevent the abuses. As a result of that, they are going to face blacklisting, where if they are accused of being a unionizer, they might not receive any work anywhere. And they could be replaced by scabs. A scab is somebody that was a replacement. Usually it's lower class, unskilled work, oftentimes marginalized groups. You can see that here, over here. Marginalized groups, which people would see as inferior, almost as a way to insult the organizers. A couple of notable examples of a strike. Now, a strike is when the workers refuse to work. And oftentimes what they would do would be physically block the ability for people to come to work, because if they're easily replaced, or if they are even there's an attempt to replace them, that ruins all their bargaining power. A notable example is the railroad strike of 1877. Note that that's the same year the Reconstruction ends. With the railroad strike of 1877, it causes this entire stoppage across all the railroads. And the reason that they stopped it was because the workers were receiving a severe wage cut and had poor working conditions, even though the railroad owners weren't losing any money. As a result of this, you can see here, these are the strikers being shot at, and these are the National Guard. So the state governments and also federal troops, these are federal troops. Federal troops are going to be sent in to break up the railroad strike. The government argued that this was okay because the interstate commerce clause in the Constitution and railroads cross state borders. So federal troops should be used to help make sure that the trains run. It also had something to do with the mail being delivered. One successful union was the Knights of Labor. and they allowed skilled workers and unskilled workers to join. This meant that they had a pretty big membership. They were fighting for what I call the union trinity, right? Better wages, an 8-hour workday, and better working conditions. They would organize strikes, and unskilled workers are going to be used to break the strikes. Now, most workers did not want to go on strike. If they could afford to go on strike, because they're not getting paid while they're on strike, if they could afford to go on strike, they wouldn't need to. Now, the ownership is going to fight against unions because unions are going to cause them to lose money. They're still going to make money, but they're going to make less money because the union's going to want to have a fair share of the profits. They're going to want to have better conditions, which costs money. And they're going to want to have better hours, which means other people are going to have to be hired, or there's going to be less product. So unions are going to be fought by the employers. Employers are going to use their connections in the media to call unions either anarchists, meaning that they're anti-government, or un-American, and they're going to say only immigrants would want to be part of a union because that's not patriotic and that's not American. How dare you demand responsible pay for your work? In 1886, there is something called the Haymarket Riot, which kind of exemplifies this. A group of workers was on strike. They met at Haymarket Square in Chicago. A bomb goes off on the edge of this demonstration, killing 8 police officers. Is a Knights of Labor rally, and there's no evidence that union members were responsible for this, but union members are going to be found guilty and held responsible. I believe the leader is actually executed, and there's a backlash against unions, even though they really didn't have much to do with it. The only real successful union is the American Federation of Labor. They only allowed skilled workers, which means that they have more of a way to go on strike, because if they strike, then it's harder to replace them. They have some bargaining chips there. They're going to use what's referred to as collective bargaining. Make sure you understand that one. Collective bargaining is this idea that the owners are going to sit on one side of the table and the workers' representatives, the union, are going to sit on the other, and then they're going to have to negotiate together. That's much better than a strike for the workers because then they don't lose out on any money. It's more successful, but it's limited because not all workers are going to be represented here. Another example here to talk about is the Homestead Steel Strike. Remember Carnegie from before? Well, Carnegie, while he has this reputation as a philanthropist and a generally well-liked guy, he's going to allow a pay cut at the Homestead, Pennsylvania steel factory, and he's going to try to crush the union there. The ownership, led by a guy named, can't remember his name, Carnegie is in charge, but the person in charge of the factory is going to send in a group called Pinkertons, which are basically hired thugs to go attack the workers. And the workers fight back. Ownership then convinces the Pennsylvania governor to send in the National Guard. And you can see this fight here between the Pinkertons and the workers. There is some women involved here as well because the families were involved. So the National Guard, again, the government being sent in to protect the factory and not help the workers. Railroad in the Pullman strike is the last example here in 1894. Again, you can see these are federal troops being used. Where's it? There you go. Federal troops being used against the workers. Railroad owners were trying to cut wages by 25%, even though they weren't really losing all that much money. And it leads to a big national railroad strike. And again, the federal troops are going to be used against the workers to break the strike. Eugene Debs, which was the American Railroad Union leader, is going to be arrested and thrown in jail for promoting this strike, and he's going to become a socialist. Later, he's going to run for office as president, or he's going to run for president 4 times and actually get about 1 million votes each time. The last time, he was actually running from prison, which is kind of interesting. And last, we've talked about the convict leasing system before. These are convicts. Is a way to get around the 13th Amendment. Essentially what happens, states would create easily violated laws like spitting in the sidewalk or loitering. Then they're going to send officers and law enforcement into especially heavily black neighborhoods, arrest people, and then they're going to put those convicts to work. They don't have to pay them because of the 13th Amendment. And then state governments are going to rent out those prisoners to private companies. And oftentimes convicts were unable to choose not to work and were punished if they refused. Essentially, historians call this slavery under a different name.